Today I'll be discussing the podcast, The Complicated Impact of Trade on Developing Countries, featuring Professor Nina Pavnik. This episode explores how trade liberalization affects countries like India, Vietnam, and Brazil, especially in terms of inequality, poverty, and labor markets. This episode explains how globalization and trade liberalization have reshaped many developing economies, particularly India, Vietnam, and Brazil. Each of these countries took steps starting in the 1980s or 1990s to reduce trade barriers, either by lowering tariffs, removing import quotas, or simplifying the regulations that previously restricted international trade. In the case of India, the trade liberalization process was mostly unilateral, meaning it wasn't part of a negotiated trade deal with any other country, like NAFTA or the EU. Instead, the government voluntarily reduced taxes on imports and removed non-tariff barriers in hopes of stimulating economic growth. Other countries, like Vietnam, opened up through bilateral agreements like the one signed with the U.S. in 2001. That deal drastically lowered tariffs on Vietnamese exports to the U.S. and gave Vietnam much greater access to global markets. These efforts were successful in many ways. One of the biggest results was a massive increase in exports. Developing countries began exporting a far greater share of their production, and trade became central to their economic models. But while exports and national GDP figures rose, the podcast is focused on what those high-level statistics don't show, which are the distributional effects within countries. Who gained, who lost, and why. One of the key issues discussed is the existence of winners and losers from globalization within these developing countries. Contrary to the idea that everyone benefits from trade, the podcast highlights that outcomes are very uneven. For instance, India, a large portion of the population still works in the informal sector. Small, unregistered firms or agricultural jobs that aren't officially counted in employment data. This made it hard to accurately measure the real impact of trade liberalization. Informal workers might have been hurt, but without data, those effects can be missed. The podcast also discusses how economic theory suggested that trade would lead countries to specialize in sectors where they have a comparative advantage. In developing economies with a lot of low-skilled labor, that would mean more demand for less educated workers and rising wages for them. But that didn't always happen. In fact, in India, the wage gap between more and less educated workers widened, which means inequality increased rather than decreased. The last major theme in this summary is the geography and mobility. The podcast highlights how location matters. When regions were dependent on industries suddenly faced import competition, firms closed or shrank, wages fell, and unemployment rose. But people often didn't move away from these struggling areas, either because of financial constraints, family or community ties, or a lack of opportunity elsewhere. So the effects of trade often became entrenched in specific places. Overall, this episode provides a more nuanced look at globalization, moving beyond simple pro or anti-trade narratives to ask harder questions about how countries can manage trade shocks and support the people most affected by them. From this episode, I learned that context really matters when it comes to evaluating the impacts of trade liberalization. What was really clear is that there's no one-size-fits-all outcome. The same trade shock, such as lowering tariffs or opening markets to foreign imports, can lead to completely different results depending on the region of the country, the type of industry in it, or even whether the person affected is working in the formal or informal sector. That last point is especially important in developing countries where a huge portion of the economy operates informally. When obtaining data, these informal sectors, such as unregistered manufacturing firms in India, often hide the real economic impacts. Since informal businesses aren't registered with the government, they aren't included in national statistics, which are usually based on tax records, formal payrolls, or official enterprise surveys. So even if trade causes widespread job losses or income shifts in these sectors, it doesn't show up clearly in the data. So this creates a serious challenge for researchers and policymakers who are trying to understand who's winning and who's losing from globalization. I found it really surprising that in places like Brazil, long-run outcomes were actually not better than the short-run ones. Economic theory often suggests that people will adjust, maybe slowly at first, but eventually will move towards jobs or regions that are more competitive. But that didn't really happen. Mobility didn't improve, meaning people mostly stayed in the same communities where they had always lived. And because of that, regional inequality stayed the same or sometimes even got worse. Certain districts that lost jobs due to import competition continued to struggle, and those effects were pretty persistent. In contrast, Vietnam had a slightly more optimistic story because they signed a trade deal with the US in 2001, so the country saw rapid growth in exports, especially in labor-intensive sectors like garments and electronics. This helped reduce poverty, but again, the gains were not evenly distributed. The most positive outcomes occurred in regions with high concentration of export-linked industries. Other regions didn't benefit nearly as much, showing that even in success stories, trade affects regions unevenly. What stood out to me the most, and this was repeated in examples across all three countries, is how uneven the outcomes of trade liberalization really are. Even in countries where trade boosted overall economic growth or lowered national poverty rates, certain regions or groups actually got worse off. In some areas, wages fell and poverty rose directly due to import competition. I hadn't realized just how central the informal economy is in shaping these outcomes. It not only complicates data collection, but it also serves as a kind of buffer zone where displaced workers often end up, usually with lower earnings and less stability. And I also hadn't appreciated how slow the adjustment process really is, for both people, but also capital. The assumption is that everyone can just shift into better jobs or move to more prosperous areas doesn't hold up in reality, and that slowness can have lasting impacts that deepen inequality. This episode connected most strongly to three core concepts from our course on the international business strategy front. The first one is pretty obvious: trade liberalization and trade rules. It's the core of the episode. The podcast walks through how countries like India, Brazil, and Vietnam reduced their tariffs and opened their economies to global trade. But what the discussion mostly highlights is that even though aggregate gains like increased exports or GDP are often positive, the micro-level outcomes vary drastically. The impact depends heavily on which industries are exposed, how productive or formal firms are, and whether local infrastructure supports the shift. So this connects directly to the idea that trade is a strategic force in economic development, but also a disruptive one that requires strong domestic policy responses to be equitable. The second concept is Levitt's globalization theory. Levitt argued that business and economies should pursue standardization across global markets to benefit from efficiency and scale. His vision was one where differences across markets would become less relevant. The quote-unquote global consumer would dominate. But this podcast really challenges that idea, and it shows that without policy interventions, the benefits of globalization often flow very disproportionately to certain regions, sectors, or skill levels. And that means globalization, rather than unifying markets, can actually exacerbate local inequalities. It's a clear example of how Levitt's idealized version of globalization doesn't fully capture what happens on the ground in developing countries, where economic, institutional, and educational differences can really radically alter outcomes. The third concept is the 6 forms of separation. So this episode particularly emphasized geographic separation. For example, how people living in more exposed or struggling districts offer greater consequences when the trade shocks hit. But it also touches on the institutional and educational separation. Formal and well-managed firms were more resilient, informal ones were not. Educated workers often fared better, while low-skilled workers lost out. These forms of separation revealed that the challenges of globalization are not just about border policy or tariffs. They're about how deep domestic gaps interact with external trade flows. Strategically, the episode reinforces that market liberalization is not enough. For countries to really benefit from global trade, they need to ensure that their workforce can move, that firms are well managed and productive, that local institutions are capable of supporting adjustment. That means that globalization outcomes depend heavily on domestic capacity to absorb trade shocks. So in the end, this is where Levitt's theory of standardization runs into limitations. The idea of a global strategy is compelling, but in practice, local context can make or break trade outcomes. Regional inequality, weak mobility, and informal sectors can all undermine the expected benefits. This podcast was a powerful reminder that even the most global economic strategies must still be grounded in local realities. This flowchart provides a more simplified way to visualize the chain reaction that occurs when developing country liberalizes trade. So it all starts with trade liberalization, meaning the country reduces tariffs and other barriers, making it easier for imports and exports to flow. As a result, domestic firms suddenly face much more competition from imported goods, specifically from foreign producers who may be more efficient or maybe offer cheaper goods. The impact this has on firms is highly uneven. Productive and well-managed firms tend to do well. They can adapt, they become more competitive, and often expand. These firms can afford to pay better wages and offer a much more stable environment, especially, obviously, in the formal sector. But less competitive firms with lower productivity or less efficient management suffer under the pressure, so they shrink or exit the market altogether. This directly affects workers. As the weaker firms contract or close, workers lose their jobs. In many developing countries, there aren't always strong safety nets or retraining programs in place, so many displaced workers fall back to the informal sector, where wages are lower, jobs are less secure, and there are fewer legal protections. And from that point on, what happens to these workers depends on a few critical factors. First, what kind of firm they end up in, meaning formal or informal. Second, how mobile they are. If they can move to a different region or industry with better prospects, they might be able to do better, but many workers can't relocate easily due to financial, cultural, or logistical barriers. And third, where they live, because the effects of trade are highly regional. So some areas benefit from the new export opportunities, while others face sharp downturns due to import competition. So the overall message of this flowchart and of the podcast as a whole is that the effects of trade depend heavily on context. Liberalization doesn't hurt or help everyone equally. It creates both opportunity and disruption. Whether someone ends up better or worse off depends on how competitive their firm is, where they live, and how well they can adjust. So to wrap up, this episode of Trade Talks made it clear that globalization and trade liberalization have complex and deeply contextual effects, especially in developing countries. On paper, trade is supposed to generate growth, reduce poverty, and create opportunities, and in many ways it does. Countries like Vietnam, for example, saw real poverty reduction and wage growth after opening their economies. But the podcast emphasized that these gains are not evenly distributed. In fact, they're highly dependent on things like the region you live in, the type of firm you work for, and whether you're employed in the formal or informal sector. Factors like low labor mobility, widespread informal employment, and large differences in firm productivity mean that trade doesn't lift all boats equally. Instead, it can become a source of inequality or even contribute to regional economic decline, especially when workers or firms can't adapt quickly enough to the new competitive environment. For me, this project was a good reminder that international business strategy has to go beyond textbook theories. It's not enough to just know about comparative advantage or trade liberalization in the abstract. Real world outcomes depend on local realities, things like infrastructure, education systems, and labor market flexibility. These are the elements that determine whether a country or even a specific community benefits from trade or suffers from it. My biggest takeaway from the podcast is that trade itself isn't the problem. The real issue is a failure to help people adjust. When policymakers don't provide the tools, training, or support systems to help workers transition, trade shocks can become damaging. This ties directly into what we've discussed in class about the importance of labor adjustment policies, firm competitiveness, and the politics of globalization. Trade is a powerful force, but how it plays out depends on how well countries prepare for and respond to its disruptive effects. So ultimately, trade can be a force for good, but only if the transition costs are acknowledged and managed properly. Without that, the risks of inequality and backlash remain high. I did use some AI tools, mostly ChatGPT, to help me synthesize the podcast layout, organize my notes into slides, and recommend a visualization strategy that best fit what the content of my notes were. And then my references were they were entirely the podcast episode and just our class notes.